Well, it's a real pleasure to have you on the show, Rick.
Yeah, well, no, it's been wonderful to see what you've done in this area and to see what you're moving on to as well. Great.
Yeah, it's been amazing to see the trajectory of what has happened even since I met you. Like, I think that was nearly 10 years ago, something like that.
Yeah, well, and just to see how much more comfortable you've gotten.
Right. I was pretty stiff when you met me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I was, I might as well share that. I was one of those people who had been taught in medical school that MDMA causes holes in the brain. And I was extremely skeptical about MDMA research when I met Rick and had been invited to support the phase 2 trial we did in Boulder. And I think you put Michael Mithofer's 2011 paper in my hand and said, well, why don't you just look at the paper and see what you think? And I saw 83% response rate. It was durable at 12 months. I thought, well, that's about 4 times better than I can do with PTSD, at least. So I better listen to this. So yeah, it's been a journey.
Yeah, that paper has had such an impact.
Yeah. It's wonderful to see you again. And so why don't we jump right in?
Yeah.
First thing I'm curious about, it's now been, 1985, or was it 86 that you...
Well, MAPS was 86.
Okay.
And I had a prior nonprofit before that I started in 84 to gather the sort of psychedelic community together to prepare to sue the DEA once they moved to criminalize ecstasy. And so MAPS is the second nonprofit.
Got it. So over 35 years that you've been at it, I'm just so curious what it must feel like for you to see all of this hard work over decades, finally seeing the change in public perception around psychedelics and getting very close now to seeing the first Schedule I psychedelic back in clinical use in your lifetime. How's that feel?
Well, it feels extraordinary. I mean, it's, to put it in context, I really decided in 1972 when I was 18 to focus my life on psychedelics. So it's been 48 years. It took, 10 years initially from 18 to 28 for me to get grounded enough from my psychedelic trips to sort of put psychedelics at the forefront of what I did in the world, even though that was where I was heading to. So one of the things that I think about how lucky I am to be a social justice activist that actually lives at the right time to see the change. So I think a lot of the people that were working for women's rights to vote or for gay rights or for civil rights, that these are multi-generational struggles. And even now, we haven't really overcome the Civil War and that kind of racism. And we're seeing that sort of coming to the surface now. And all these monuments to Confederate generals and all. And so I just feel so lucky that I was able to grow up at a time in the 60s where I saw the flourishing of psychedelics. Then I saw the backlash. That's where I decided to get involved. Then I saw MDMA, which I learned about in 82 as a therapeutic drug. And although it was at the same time ecstasy, so it was clear there would be a second backlash. So then I saw the second backlash against that with MDMA criminalized in 85, and now I'm seeing the opening up. And one of the things also that I'm most proud of in the entire history of MAPS and what we have accomplished is that in 2008 and near the end of 2007, we got approval for LSD research, which was the first time in about 35 years that LSD research had been approved. And we did that a few months before Anita Hoffman and Albert Hoffman died. So they got to see not the sort of full flowering of the psychedelic renaissance, but they got to see LSD research being approved by the Swissmedic and getting ready to start with our sponsorship in Switzerland before they died. So, I've thought, being Jewish, I've thought a lot about the whole stories of Moses. And, the idea is that Moses led the Jews out of slavery, but then he died before he entered the promised land. And God told him that because he had, killed this overseer, he committed murder, and he wouldn't be allowed into the promised land. So, for me, the promised land is FDA approval of psychedelics and starting all these psychedelic clinics. So, if I'm continuing to be lucky, I may be witnessing this, ushering us into this promised land.
Well, I think you're going to get to see the promised land. So,
yeah, well,
your story is going to get to be a little different than Moses, hopefully.
Yeah, well, yeah, and one thing I'll just say about Moses is so that there was an article by an Israeli psychologist, and he talked about how the burning bush vision and all of that Moses must have been high when he saw that, and that manna was something that was proposed as, this magic food that developed, but this psychologist proposed that was actually a psychedelic drug, and that Moses was high on psychedelics. So I went to my father, who's been very supportive. He's a doctor. He's no longer alive. He died at 93. He was a pediatrician. But I said, Dad, look at this. Moses was high. This validates everything I'm doing. Psychedelics, Judaism, it's all from the very beginning. And he said, well, in order for me to believe that, first off, I'd have to believe in Moses. Because as it turns out, there's no historical evidence or archaeological evidence that the Jews built the pyramids, or that, they traveled all these communities through the Negev, through the Sinai Desert and stuff. But in any case, yeah, I hope my story is different than Moses's.
Well, let's dive into, so we're going to mostly talk about MDMA because, we covered different things in the podcast on psychedelics, and we thought, wow, we've got one of the kind of spearheaders here on MDMA. And we thought a great starting point about MDMA is to just first talk about when it was being used legally for psychotherapy. Back in I guess it was both late 70s and early 80s. Is that right? So when it was being used, what exactly were people using it for? Was it more of like psychoanalysis type dive-ins, or because back then trauma wasn't a huge conversation yet, right? It wasn't as big as it is now in terms of using that language.
Yeah. So I think we need to go back a little bit further into the 60s, where there was a drug called MDA. So MDA, methylene dioxyamphetamine, which is a little bit more like an LSD MDMA combination. And then MDMA, which is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. So MDA, which was referred to by sort of non-medical users as the miracle drug of America, because it promoted this open-heartedness and it had this psychedelic component. It was, very popular. And in fact, in 1972 and the late 60s, there was studies that were being done with MDA for psychotherapy. And so when the Controlled Substances Act came down in 1970 and criminalized MDA, a bunch of chemists had been, particularly Sasha Shulgin, had been looking at ways to modify drugs that were illegal, because at the time the DEA had to specify that a specific molecule was illegal, and if you tinkered with it, then it was a new thing and it was legal. Now we have the analog bill that they've tried to make it so that analogs are illegal if what they're based on is illegal, but it's hard to enforce. But in any case, once MDMA was sort of rediscovered in the middle 70s, it was given by Sasha Shulgin and Ann Shulgin. They tried it themselves first. Then they had a core group of 12 people that they used to test out new drugs. And they felt that everybody has a unique kind of response, so that if they could get a group of 12 and get all their different responses, they can get a good sense of what this drug might be. And they felt that MDMA had this incredible therapeutic potential. And so then they turned it over to Leo Zeff. And we've published a book called The Secret Chief Revealed. Leo was the secret chief, the leader of the underground psychedelic therapy movement. And he was a clinical psych PhD, Jewish. He had his own copy of the Torah, very spiritual. And he was doing a lot of work with LSD and other drugs illegally underground. And he was planning to retire. And once he experienced MDMA, he thought that this had enormous therapeutic potential and that he would not retire. And then he ended up training 100 or so therapists and psychiatrists in how to work with MDMA. So what it was used for, and it was used under the name Adam. So it was kind of a scramble of MDMA, so that they didn't want the word to get out what it really was, because the fear was that that might become more easily criminalized. But also they wanted to sort of evoke the Garden of Eden and original state of innocence. And because there's a way in which MDMA is like a truth serum. It helps you accept yourself. You can be a better listener for critical comments, reduces fear, all these different things. So it began to be used for couples therapy a lot, but also for personal growth. It was being used for people that were scared of dying who had cancer. It was being used for quite a wide range of things. And in fact, it was also being used for Vietnam vets who had PTSD. So while there wasn't such a widespread cultural focus on trauma and PTSD that there is now, there were still, large numbers of people that were still traumatized, in the late 70s, early 80s by Vietnam. And what we don't get enough attention to is that most of the people in America that are traumatized are women from sexual abuse or childhood sexual complex PTSD or adult rape and assault, things like that. So around almost 2/3 of our subjects are women, but the vets get the most attention. So MDMA was used in a wide range of things. A lot of them were not particularly patients, but for spiritual purposes, for personal growth, for vision quests, and it spread quite widely. The MDMA, actually, a lot of it came from MIT, from chemists there that made it at night in the labs. So the MIT group was one of the big distributors. And they ended up distributing from the middle 70s to the early 80s, somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 doses in these therapeutic personal growth contexts. And these were done in private homes, in private settings. And so the DEA had no idea that this was going on. And the situation is, though, that some of the people that had experience in these circles decided that more people should know about it, that they could make a lot of money. And so it became ecstasy. And it became more used in bars and clubs and recreational settings. That's what attracted the attention of the DEA. And so when they moved to criminalize ecstasy in the summer of '84, they had no idea that it was used as a therapeutic drug as well. And so when we think about what it is that we could learn from that early experience with the therapeutic use of MDMA, the first thing is a lot of people don't know, and maybe a bunch of the people listening to this don't know, that MDMA was a therapy drug before it was a party drug. So that's really important to establish. Also, once it became illegal, even still, a lot of people, underground therapists, kept using it instead of MDA. It's a little bit easier to work with. It's more gentle. It's more grounded. It's very profound. It really goes very deep in terms of self-acceptance, self-love. And so I think that some of the main things that we can learn from that earlier experience are that it has, in pharma, they call it a pipeline and a pill, in a sense that you want a drug that has multiple different clinical indications, because then it's more efficient economically to develop it for multiple indications. So I'd say MDMA is, as is psilocybin and LSD, these are classic pipelines in a pill, because the treatment is not really the drug. The treatment is the therapy, which the drug makes more effective. So all of the different things that psychotherapy can be good for, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy can be good for.
Great. Thank you for the background, Rick. And so why don't we fast forward from 1985 to today and tell us what's happening with phase 3, how many subjects have been completed so far, how did the interim analysis go?
Okay. I do for one moment just about the early days, and then we'll do this pivot, which is that in 1983, I contacted the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, a fellow named Robert Mueller, who was a French resistance fighter. He was like the mystic at the UN. And so he talked about how we need to have a global spirituality, and that is really a lot of the conflicts between countries are religious-based. We need this global spirituality. Anyway, I contacted him. He said nothing about psychedelics. He referred me to a bunch of mystics. So the thing that I missed by talking about the early work was that MDMA was used by Roman Catholic monks, Zen Buddhists, meditators, and it was used as a tool for meditation. Half doses in meditation help people have a deeper quiet to achieve states that they were otherwise unable to do. And then once you had that experience once, then you could get back there without the drug through practice. So that it was like, climbing up to the top of a tree and seeing where you need to walk, but then you need to walk back down into the forest and walk out. So there was that other kind of spiritual aspect to it, not just therapeutic.
And I think what I hear you saying right before we get to today is that although there were different indications that were very apparent in the early days of using it for psychotherapy, there were couples work, there were different things going on. It seems like that as we came forward in time, I don't know whether this was a political choice or not. It seems like, wait a second, this is a really, really good trauma work. Let's focus on that in the research. What happened there?
Well, that was a strategic decision. It was a political decision. So I like to say that we don't do science, we do political science. We do drug development science, of course. But, it was 1982, actually, that I met a veteran from Vietnam who had PTSD. And he talked about how the MDMA helped him to relax where he'd been shot by a bullet, and that he carried a lot of tension in his body where he'd been shot. And that contributed to his trauma. And under the influence of the MDMA, his musculature relaxed, and also he was able to more deeply process that trauma of being shot. So the political calculations were, first off, of all the psychedelics, which one was most likely to make it through the regulatory system first? And then was going to be the question, which of the clinical indications would be paired with that psychedelic in order to try to move forward with something that was so highly controversial. So the idea of MDMA was that it's the most gentle of all the psychedelics. It's the easiest to integrate. It's the least likely to produce, quote, bad trips or difficult experiences, although it really helps people process really difficult experiences. And then the other part, and Will, you could maybe speak to this, is that part of our belief is that the training of therapists and the training of psychiatrists to work with psychedelics will be enhanced if they've done the drug themselves in a therapeutic setting as the patient. And so I felt that it's not necessary, it's not essential, but it's not that everybody that's done MDMA will be a better therapist than everybody that's not. It's just that each person will be more effective if they've done it. And now I know that's not true with psychiatry. You don't think you have to get electroconvulsive therapy to give it to people, or you don't actually have to take all your antipsychotic drugs yourself. But that's where those drugs and the ECT are the treatment itself. In this case, it's the therapeutic alliance and the relationship that really contributes to the growth. And so therefore, it does make sense, I think, for the therapist to have the experience. And I felt that there's less resistance in psychiatry and psychotherapy for them taking MDMA than there would be for taking LSD or psilocybin. So, well, I don't know if you want to...
That makes, I agree with you from the perspective as a psychiatrist that MDMA is an easier entry point. For the audience, what Rick is referring to is a FDA-approved training study where people like me and other future MDMA psychotherapists have an opportunity to undergo the protocol and experience MDMA-assisted psychotherapy as the patient. And to be brief, I'll just say it was incredibly valuable as a training tool to know what that feels like and how open you can feel and how trusting you can feel and how little fear there is in that situation. And, not only as a training experience, but also as a personal experience, it was incredibly deep and valuable for me. So I think that's a really important factor in training therapists. And we're going to get to questions about training therapists in a few minutes, but I'm very curious how all of this is going to work out as we, expand things.
I don't think that the companies doing psilocybin research, Compass and Usona, think that they have not tried to create opportunities for their trainees to experience psilocybin. But I still think for us it's very important. And so that's how we came to MDMA. Then how did we come to PTSD?
tell us a little bit about how far we've gotten in phase 3, how the interim data analysis went, how many subjects have gotten through at this point? Okay.
So for phase 3, the agreement that we made with the FDA that we have to do 2 100-person phase 3 studies. And what FDA said was that they think that we can prove efficacy with smaller numbers than they want to see for safety. And so we also agreed with FDA that we would do what's called an interim analysis of each of the 2 phase 3 studies. So it's kind of remarkable, the situation, and it shows the power of the pharmaceutical lobby. Because often when you do a scientific experiment, you look at your prior data, you do your power calculations, you do your statistical analysis, you come up with how many subjects you think you're going to need under certain conditions, and then you do the study. And then at the end of it, you uncover the data and you either failed or succeeded. But the interim analysis is for what's called sample size re-estimation. And what that means is that you have an unblinded, independent data monitoring committee, and they take a look at your actual data. They compare it to your hypothetical data that you use for your power calculations. And if your actuals are not quite as good as you had hypothesized, you can still get the drug approved, you can still get statistical significance, but you would need to add more people to the study. And so what that means basically is the stronger the signal, the bigger the effect size, the fewer the number of people you need to see it. And so you can have studies, sometimes pharma has studies of thousands of people, and you can get statistical significance for trivial differences.
Right.
Drug approved. Because the FDA thinks, well, these are group averages between the placebo group and your test group, and maybe some people will respond more than others. Maybe one day you'll figure out who they are, and then also they leave it to the marketplace to kind of sort it out. So we agreed that we would do an interim analysis at 60 people out of the 100 had reached their primary outcome measure. So we would have 60 people, basically 30 and 30 from the placebo group, which is therapy without MDMA versus therapy with MDMA. And we had to have all 100 people enrolled. And by enrolled, it means just through screening. They don't have to be actually treated yet. And we require people to taper off of their medications as well to be in the study. So people could be enrolled and they're in a month or 2 of the tapering process to get off their psychiatric medication. So we had our interim analysis in March of 2020. There's only 2 drugs that have been approved by the FDA for what's called breakthrough therapy, or designated breakthrough therapy, MDMA, and a drug called Tonmya, a repurposed sleeping pill from the 30 years ago, and they thought it would help people not have nightmares. They did their interim analysis in February, and it failed for futility. And they'd spent well over $100 million, and the drug didn't work. Mm. So that knocked out their breakthrough therapy drug, and their stock went down and all that. We had our interim analysis in March, and what we learned is that we were doing great, that we didn't need to add a single person to the study, and that we had a 90% or greater probability of statistical significance once the study was completed and we had the primary outcome data for all 100. Now, that was in March. And we know the COVID and the lockdown happened shortly after that. So what FDA did is that they reached out to us and to a lot of other sponsors, and they said, we know that enrollment is going to be slower, or in some cases has stopped for a while. And so they gave us an option to end the first phase 3 study early. And so we sort of polled all the different teams of therapists, which were willing to continue, which of the patients that were sort of in the process were willing to continue, which were not. And we decided that we would propose to FDA that we would end the study with 90 subjects instead of 100, and that all 90 didn't have to really go through the whole study, that some people, as long as they had a baseline measure and they'd been through at least one of the 3 MDMA sessions or the placebo sessions, the 8-hour day-long sessions, and then had an outcome measure after that we could end it like that. So that's a bit of a risk, you could say, on our side, because the 90% or greater probability of statistical significance was with all 100 people.
Right.
And so we decided that we would end it with 90. And so the last data point is now coming in about 2 weeks.
Wow.
And we will have, before the end of September, we're going to know if the first phase 3 study was statistically significant.
Wow. That's coming up soon.
Very soon. And if so, and we think it's very likely that it will be statistically significant, then the chances are that the second phase 3 study will be statistically significant as well, and we can start really planning for commercialization. Now, we could screw up the second phase 3 study. It doesn't mean automatically it'll work, but it will be the most important signal that we've had in the entire drug development program with MDMA. Does our first phase 3 study succeed? And we have now started enrollment for our second phase 3 study, but unfortunately, only 4 of the 11 sites in the United States are ready to start.
Okay.
So we're starting enrollment there. I think Boulder, Fort Collins, New Orleans, and I think one of the San Francisco or LA sites is ready to start. The others, I think, are going to come online over the next month or so, or month or two. Not all of them may. We also have 2 sites in Israel and 2 in Canada. The Israeli sites are getting ready to start.
Mm-hmm.
But because of COVID, we anticipate that it'll be a lot slower. And so now we're assuming 2 years that the second phase 3 study will be done by middle of 2022.
Okay.
We're hoping that it will be approved before the end of 2022 or early 2023, assuming our data justifies that.
Right. Great. And so the process with FDA after the completion of these 2 phase 2 studies is it similar to the end of phase 2 meetings where you go in and you present the data and you have a conversation, or what's the process of getting MDMA off Schedule 1, if assuming that you have 2 statistically significant phase 3 studies?
Well, we need a whole lot of other studies too. So the FDA is wanting us to do animal toxicity studies. They want us to do studies with pregnant rats. And, we already exclude people that are pregnant. So this is our sort of what kind of precautions do we need to take? We already do pregnancy tests before every session for every woman who could conceivably become pregnant. So we have to combine all of the data from phase 3, from our other studies, and also what's called CMC, chemistry, manufacturing, and control data. That's about the product itself. So we're spending about $5.6 million to produce about 17 kilos of MDMA that could be used in a commercial post-approval context. So all of that we submit to FDA in what's called a new drug approval or a new drug application, NDA. Mm-hmm. And that process, we have, because it's a breakthrough therapy, we can do what's called a rolling NDA, meaning we can submit them the data about the CMC data about the product. We can submit them the animal toxicity data, the different things at different stages. But it will take the FDA probably 6 months or so to review all the data. Then, most likely, and it's not 100% sure, the FDA will call a public advisory committee meeting. And they will present the data and they will get the advisory committee meetings recommendations. The FDA doesn't have to accept the recommendations of the advisory committee. Sometimes they don't. But there will probably be this public advisory committee meeting, and that's where you have members of the public, but also key opinion leaders and various people sort of argue the case out from the data to this advisory committee. And these are appointed by the FDA. They have advisory committees throughout the FDA for all the different things. But we think that would probably work really well because we do have connections with key opinion leaders all over the world, and they're seeing the value of MDMA. So what happens, though, is let's say the FDA says, yes, they'll approve the drug. Then the FDA has a group called the Controlled Substances Staff that works on controlled substances and trying to figure out what schedule should it go. Should it go from 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 or 1 to 5? Now, the DEA has their own evaluation of what schedule it should be in. So then the FDA Controlled Substance Staff and the DEA meet together, and so there has to be a rescheduling. And we're going to probably propose Schedule 3 or Schedule 4.
And Rick, I know what's on a lot of people's minds right now is, first of all, what is this approval going to actually look like on the ground in terms of, is this going to have to be given in a psychiatrist's office? Are you going to have one therapist, two therapists? Who are they going to be? Like, there's a lot of questions people have right now about that. Where are we at with all of that?
All right, so that's called the REMS, the Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy. So the FDA, for thalidomide, which was the sort of quintessential bad drug, caused it was for morning sickness, caused birth defects. The FDA was able to develop special requirements for special risks for the drug, and they first did that with thalidomide. Now they do that for every drug. They look at, do there need to be these REMS? So we were already preliminary negotiating this with FDA and DEA. And so what we're proposing is that the drug is not the treatment. It's the therapy, is the treatment that the drug makes more effective. So the only people that can be directly working with patients are people that have been through the training program run by the sponsor or authorized by the sponsor, and in learning the psychotherapy component. And then we're also proposing that it's like completely different than medical marijuana or many drugs that you know that are able to be taken home. This would only be administered under direct supervision of the therapist. Now, as far as whether it needs to be in a psychiatrist's office or not, we're also arguing with the FDA right now about whether there needs to be a doctor on site or a doctor on call. So for the study that was at Boulder, that was really well done, as the doctor does the screening, and then
right.
The doctor doesn't actually need to be on site the entire time of the treatment. The doctor just needs to be called.
Yeah, that's how it was for me as the study physician in Boulder. Right.
Yeah. That's where we really set the precedent too, that the doctor doesn't need to be on site.
Okay.
All right, so we're still arguing that out with FDA. For certain new studies, they're trying to make it so there needs to be a doctor now in the building. But they're used to like institutional studies where there's, hospital settings, doctors in the building. But they've agreed for the Bronx VA study that we're trying to get approved there that as long as there's a doctor in the building, the lead therapist doesn't need to be an MD PhD. The lead therapist can be a licensed therapist, and the second person doesn't need to be licensed, can be a student, has to have some mental health training that is not fully defined. So to answer your question about whether there needs to be a two-therapist team, so far the answer is going to be yes. And the FDA will want us, if we want to move to just one therapist, we'll have to do other studies with just one therapist to demonstrate. Now, the reason we are doing two therapists, and we realize that it increases the cost substantially, but we think that this is a controversial drug. There have been instances in the past where therapists administering MDMA to their patients are in open, trusting way. There's been sexual relationships have developed. This is in the 80s, and it was kind of scandalous. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen, particularly in the early stages when you're starting to roll something out. And we also think that two therapists are better than one. We don't think that they're twice as good. But where we want to get to is no doctor on site, but a doctor on call. We want there to be a two therapy team, but the one therapist should be only licensed to do therapy, not MD PhD. And the other, we would like to ideally be working for free or for a little amount of money to be supervised by the first person to get their own approval to be a lead person if they're a licensed therapist. But we're also realizing the FDA wants the second person to have a bachelor's degree. And we don't think that that's necessary. So we would ideally in the future imagine somebody could be a massage therapist or a music therapist or an acupuncturist or any number of different things that may or may not require a college degree. So once the drug is approved initially, it will be a two-person team. The therapist will need to be through our training program. And this will also be true for psilocybin, I think, as well. And there will at least we're still arguing whether but we hope there will not need to be a doctor on site. Now, the big modification for this is going to be once we start looking at group therapy. And we think that group therapy is going to be a very important thing for us to try to develop and implement. And so the question will be, what is going to be the ratio of the therapist to the patients? We don't want there to be two. If it's a group of 4, we don't want there to be 8 therapists. It's the whole point is to try to reduce, the cost of it and to see if there's benefits that come from the group supporting each other. We are concerned with PTSD in particular, either from military-related PTSD or sexual abuse. There's a lot of guilt and shame, and people are sometimes reluctant to talk about that in a group setting.
Right.
Now, maybe a group setting makes them more likely because somebody else opens up and that gives them courage, so that there can be that. But the only group therapy project that's been done so far was done with psilocybin, but it was done with group preparation and group integration, but individual sessions. So that does save a bit of money, but it's still individual sessions. So I think we will be going forward after approval, hopefully even before that, to start some of these group therapy studies. And what we think, you look at ayahuasca ceremonies or Native American church peyote ceremonies, they have large groups with only a few shamans leading it. But at the same time, most of these people they're not severe PTSD. They don't require that kind of direct support as much. Some dealing with addiction, the Native American church deals a lot with alcoholism and all.
Right. And then, Rick, in terms of training, so let's say over the next 10 years, we have thousands or tens of thousands of therapists that need to be trained in this. Yeah. Is the idea right now that MAPS is going to hold all of that?
Well, we are going to set the standards for the training. We are training more trainers. But the ideal situation for us to scale up is that we would authorize different groups to run their own training. So, for example, at the Bronx VA with Rachel Yehuda, she wants to not only do an experiment there with treating veterans. The experiment would be comparing 2 sessions versus 3 sessions. Eventually, she wants to do a group therapy program, but she also wants to train therapists throughout the VA system. And so it's more likely that therapists throughout the VA system, if the VA decides that this training should be widespread, that they would rather house the training and run it themselves, rather than have them all come to us. So we would authorize them to do the training. They would sit in some of our own training sessions. We would say, yes, we think you're good enough to train others. And then another part of this is a protocol where we have it so that therapists can volunteer to take MDMA as part of their training, which Will went through as well.
Right.
The situation that Will went through was where we were training people for phase 3, where there's a control group and then there's the experimental group. And so the protocol that Will went through was 4 days where you have either MDMA or placebo for a day-long session. Then you have a day of integration. Then you have the crossover. You get whatever you didn't get the first time. You get the third day and then a 4th day of integration. So for going forward for treating people post-approval or for expanded access, there aren't going to be control groups. So we're now negotiating with FDA to get approval for a 2-day program instead of a 4-day program. But FDA has been balking at that. And so we're in the midst of a formal dispute with FDA about getting this new protocol approved. But it would always be voluntary. I'll say we're never going to require anybody to take MDMA. We think that MDMA helps people understand, going through it helps them understand what it is. I mean, Will, you could say how hopefully you thought it was for you.
Absolutely. It's a very powerful experience for me personally and also as a training experience.
Yeah, so we did a survey with 79 people that went through it. That's the summary of most everybody. And so we're still negotiating with FDA on that. But we would authorize different groups. So let's assume, for example, that some of the expanded access sites who are actually treating PTSD patients, and we're supervising them on their first patient. The first step would be, once people have actually, therapists have had experience working with a PTSD patient under supervision, and they've done that several times, then we think they would be able to have a protocol to give MDMA to other therapists. They would know enough about how the PTSD therapy works, then they could give it to healthy volunteers. So yeah, we think that because of the scale of need for therapists and for training, that's the real issue for scaling. And so we would have our own trainings, but we would also be authorizing other centers around the country. And also because we're public benefit, not profit oriented for the Public Benefit Corporation, what we've figured out is that from a public benefit perspective, the real public benefit is helping people get over PTSD. So the training program, we're thinking of operating at our cost. We're not thinking of the training program as a profit center. And so that's why we're very much not trying to keep it within MAPS and that we're doing all of it. And so we want to distribute the training as much as possible, but we want to hold fast on the quality. And so that's
that makes sense. And Rick, the flip side of this question is, this sounds like a very expensive service to be able to offer as the providers. If you have a doctor involved, you have the therapist, long hour sessions, so many sessions. Yeah. So obviously a lot of patients are like, am I going to be able to afford this? What is this going to look like? And just where are we at with your thoughts on how much is this going to cost the patient?
Well, we think that it will cost around $5,000 for each MDMA session and for the preparation and integration and screening. So for a 3-session model with 3 day-long sessions with 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, it's 42 hours of therapy with 2 therapists. So the cost will vary according to where the therapists are. Sometimes therapists in New York will charge one price, therapists in New Orleans will charge another price. But more or less, we're hoping it'll be in the neighborhood of $15,000 or less for the full program. Now, some people post-approval will only need 1 session. Some will need 2 sessions. Some will need 4 sessions. So we think the standard model will be 2 sessions, and that's what Rachel Yehuda wants to test out at the Bronx VA, 2 sessions versus 3 sessions. We know that people get better from the 3rd session, but maybe at the 1-year follow-up, people who got 2 sessions only are going to be more or less similar to the people that got 3, because we see that people learn how to heal themselves and they can keep getting better over time. So we don't know if that's true, but we do think also that people will heal faster if they have 3 sessions. But maybe the standard model will be 2 sessions, $10,000. So the big question is going to be insurance coverage. So we're working with a fellow, Elliot Marseille, who is a healthcare economist at the UC San Francisco, and he's got a private consulting company, and he's looked at our and he's doing this all pro bono. He's looked at our data from phase 2 and has shown that he thinks that it's cost effective within several years. So it is more expensive initially than just giving somebody a pill or treating them 1 hour a week. But what we see at the VA is that sometimes people go to weekly therapy for decades and decades. So over time, this is going to be more effective, plus it's got better results. So the other part for the veterans, let's just say, is that if you are disabled with PTSD, the average lifetime cost of that to the VA for your disability payments is $1.5 million. So if we have a $15,000 treatment, and let's say from our phase 2 data at the 1-year follow-up, 2/3 no longer had PTSD, it's enormously cost effective for the VA or the Department of Defense to offer this. So, but the other part that I think directly addresses your question about the cost is that we believe that the drug war fundamentally counterproductive, doesn't help reduce drug abuse, it's racist, it is not useful, it's always been for suppression of minorities, and that MDMA is the most inherently therapeutic of all the psychedelics, not that it is automatically, but we believe that people should have access to this without having to go through MAPS, without having to go through medicine, or without having to pretend that it's now their religious freedom to use MDMA. Not that that's necessarily pretend, and that's true for other psychedelics like ayahuasca and peyote have been approved by religious freedom. So we're working to do harm reduction at Burning Man and elsewhere to help people who've taken these drugs illegally. And we're also now helping in Denver and in Oakland, where they've decriminalized mushrooms and other plant psychedelics, to help them implement that. So our Sarah Gale, who's from our Boulder site, who Will knows, and she was in charge of the Zendo program. She's part of a commission for the City Council of Denver to monitor and to prepare for how their mushroom decrim lowest enforcement priority goes into effect. So they'll be educating police and hospitals. So all of this is to say that we anticipate that at some point after the country has legalized marijuana on a federal basis, and after we've got maybe a decade of psychedelic clinics rolled out, that we will move to a post-prohibition world of licensed legalization for psychedelics so that people can have access on their own. And we'll try to train them to help each other and to do peer support. So I think that will address the cost in a certain way. But I think the hardest cases are going to go to the clinics. And that's where it's going to be really important that we do try to get insurance coverage. And so that's our challenge, is to really show cost effectiveness.
And then for the 1/3 of people who still haven't experienced the full resolution of their PTSD at the 12-month follow-up, do you anticipate that there'll be availability for people to have booster sessions of MDMA psychotherapy if beyond the 2 or 3 session protocol?
Yes. So so the big question that we didn't discuss in terms of the reps, we talked about, doctor on site or doctor on call, the qualifications of the therapist, the training requirements. There's a possibility, and this we see with ketamine, and we see it with GHB, Xyrem, that there could be what's called a patient registry. So right now there's not a patient registry, and it's possible that the FDA could say that there's a lifetime limit on the number of MDMA sessions that people can get. And if so, they would probably put it at 8 or 10, somewhere like that. So we're trying to argue against the patient registry, but I think we're likely to end up with one, which means that then we track how many sessions each patient has got.
Right.
What we feel, though, is that some people will need more than 2 sessions. Some people will need 3. Some people could need 4. Some people could need 2, and then 2 years later need another one. So, but we think that if people have 8 sessions, let's say, and it didn't work for them for their PTSD, we're not saying it works for everybody. Then that should be enough. Now, I've taken MDMA about 120 times in my life since 1982. I keep learning new stuff when I take it, but I'm not curing PTSD. I'm learning things. It's about my relationship with my wife and things like that. So I think there's other ways people can learn more from these experiences. But in terms of treating PTSD, I think that it's very important that there be this opportunity, as you say, for sort of a supplemental session years if the PTSD returns or if they get re-traumatized.
Exactly.
But I will say one thing is one of the vets that was in our study has developed a certain resilience. Once you heal from PTSD and you learn how to process trauma, so this is a fellow, John Lubecki, and he's spoken publicly about this, is that after he was through the program, and this happened about a year ago, there was someone that his house is part of a group of houses that are on a small pond. And there was someone who was doing the landscaping, and they were on a riding mower, and they were on the mower trying to get to the grass closest to the pond. The riding mower fell over, became unbalanced, trapped the guy underneath it. John came and brought him out from underwater, gave him mouth to mouth, and the guy died in John's arms when he was trying.
Oh, wow.
And so he didn't sleep that night, but he called Michael Midhover and worked through some stuff, and he didn't develop PTSD. So he had a certain resilience. About 3 months ago, he was at an event trying to reach a politician to talk to about MDMA. And when he, after the event, he went outside, and there was somebody a few blocks away that he saw, just a block or so away, was looks like giving CPR to somebody. So he went over to see about helping out, and it turned out that he took over doing CPR for this guy, but he had been shot in the chest by sort of a drive-by shooting.
Wow.
And this guy also died in John's arms.
Wow.
So second person dying while John's giving CPR within a year. And luckily, he called me about it, and I was on the phone with Michael Midhover. So we talked him through it, and he did not develop PTSD. All of this to say is that there's a certain resilience that people will develop, but some people will not be that resilient. Something will happen, the PTSD will come back, and yes, they will be able to get other treatments. Now, the other thing to say is that of the 1/3 that still has PTSD, almost all of them had what's called clinically significant reduction in PTSD symptoms. It's not that they got no benefits. Their benefits were just relatively smaller than the others, and they ended up still qualified for a PTSD diagnosis. But if they were to get a 4th session, maybe they would be below the level.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I'm glad to hear that there will be at least some opportunity beyond the 2 to 3 sessions for people who need that, and for people who, who relapse or who, get a new trauma. I mean, I think that's really important. That could be very devastating to recover from PTSD and then have a new trauma and not have access to the thing that helped you reclaim your life. Yeah. So thanks for explaining that. Yeah.
I think for the last portion here of the show, we should get a little personal with you, because I'm really curious about, I kind of see you as one of the sort of psychedelic kings on the planet, of like championing this cause, right? And I'm just curious, you mentioned your 120 times with MDMA, and I'm curious about what role psychedelics played in your life, because obviously you must care about them for some reason.
Well, I'll describe. At one point, this was around 1984, and I had decided in 1972 to focus my life on psychedelics when I was 18. So I was at Esalen, studying with Stan Groff, and Esalen is at the edge of the cliffs, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And I was just thinking, I wonder what my life would be like if it wasn't organized on psychedelics. What would I be doing? And I felt this kind of vortex, like of emptiness and fear, like pulling me over the edge of the cliff, like into the unknown, like I would be like lost. So I don't know but psychedelics have been sort of the center of my life starting from age 18. I needed to integrate a lot of experiences. So for 10 years, from 18 to 28, I was building houses and getting grounded in the physical world. I'd taken so much psychedelics, I was kind of spacey. I didn't properly understand that you need to integrate your psychedelic experiences. I just thought the more you take, the faster you evolve. And, sadly, that's not the case. And it can actually make you worse. But what they've meant to me, I think I can explain it by saying that when I was 13 and my bar mitzvah took place, and in the morning after my bar mitzvah, I'm lying in bed at home and I'm thinking, where's God? I mean, I'm the same person as before. This rite of passage did not work for me. It didn't turn me into a man. It didn't make me feel more spiritual. It was a party and I got presents and that was good. And I read from the Torah and I did all this Hebrew stuff. But I didn't feel like this ritual, which I feel in the past, for thousands of years, these kind of rites of passage connected with Judaism, with Christianity, have probably worked for a lot of people. But somehow or other in the modern culture, for me, it didn't work. And I felt this emptiness. And I actually remember waiting every morning for a week after my bar mitzvah, thinking, maybe a lot of people got bar mitzvah this day. God is slow coming around to me. I'm in the second list, not the first list. But nothing kept happening. Nothing. And then the next week comes by and a whole group of new people get bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. And I'm like, okay, it's not going to happen. And so when I first did LSD, when I was 17, 4 years plus later, I was almost 18 when I did it. So almost 5 years later, I felt like this is what my bar mitzvah should have been. This is moving these kind of energies. And even though it was scary and I couldn't completely let go, but I had, the ego dissolution and the sense of being connected through historical time and evolution and all this, I thought, this is filling a hole in my spirit that the sort of traditional rites of passage didn't. And so that's what started. And then what I really thought too is that I was very much super shy in high school, could hardly talk to a girl, and was very much in the world of ideas. So I was reading books. I was very political. I thought the Beatles were stupid because the Beatles were initially all these love songs. I want to hold your hand. And I just like, the Vietnam, the world's on fire, the civil rights, people are getting assassinated. Who cares? I want to hold your hand.
That was before they took LSD.
So what's the point of it? And so what psychedelics did when I first started taking it is giving me access to my emotions. I felt like they were really helping me to feel. And even though it was difficult feelings, all of a sudden, it wasn't just thoughts in my head. So it sort of opened up a new dimension of life for me, which was emotions and really powerful emotions.
Wow, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I have a similar story, Rick. A similar childhood as you. The bar mitzvah story and, my first psychedelic experiencing opening up an emotional whirlwind that I didn't actually know how to deal with.
Yeah. If we have a moment, I'll just share what happened when I was 21. So when I turned 21, I finally, I had a girlfriend. We were actually living together, but she was away for a couple months studying pottery in England. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to be alone on my 21st birthday. What should I do? I should take LSD. And I thought that would be a great way to celebrate becoming an adult. So this was, again, now 1974. When I was turning 21. And that was in the olden days when there was such a thing called records. And so I had put these records on the record player, and you stack a bunch of the records up. And so, and when you're doing LSD, you get very intently focused. And I was at the end of a dead-end street. I could make this long, but I'll try to make this short. I was at the end of a dead-end street, and I was in Sarasota, Florida, which is an hour south of Tampa, Florida. My girlfriend's father had been in the Air Force in World War II, and he was part of the group that was dropping the atomic bombs on the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He would have been in the third plane, my girlfriend's father. And he actually brought over the guy that was in the first plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And so I met him, and we had some conversations. And Tampa, Florida is sort of the center of where we run our wars from. We think the wars are run from the Pentagon. A lot of the planning is in the Pentagon, but operationally, a lot of it is run out of Tampa, and they have underground bunkers for airplanes with nuclear weapons. And so I knew all of that. All right. So I'm taking LSD. I'm 21 years old. I'm listening to music. I'm at the end of this dead end street. I'm having a great time. And then there was quiet, and I was just super absorbed in this quiet. And then I heard this sound that sounded to me like an air raid siren. Somehow or other, I interpreted the sound as an air raid siren. And I thought immediately, what a tragedy. I'm just turning 21. I have the whole life ahead of me, but the Russians are dropping the bomb on Tampa. And I was like, why is there an air raid siren? There wasn't an air raid siren this time of the day normally. It was just like, it had to be the Russians dropping the bomb, and my life was going to be over. And I thought, well, okay, as long as my life's going to be over pretty soon, what I need to do is cram a whole lifetime of life into the next few minutes before I incinerate. So I thought, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk out of the house, and I'm going to walk down the street in the direction of Tampa, and I'm going to just watch the bomb as it explodes and obliterates me. And there was a line in a Grateful Dead song that sort of came to me. One of the lines was, I don't know, but I've been told in the heat of the sun, a man died of cold. This idea that your mind, so I don't believe your mind can control everything. It's not all about us. But I thought, okay, so as I'm walking down the road and I'm thinking I've only got a few minutes left to live, I was just suddenly aware of all of the beauty of all the different shades of green, of all of the plants around. There was flowers I'd planted, passion flowers in front of my house. And I was just overwhelmed by the beauty of nature, and then the clouds and the beauty of the white clouds and the blue sky. And it just was, and then the sounds of the birds and the sounds of everything. So I just felt like my consciousness opened up in this beautiful way. So I wasn't terrified with fear. I was just taking in life at a rate that I had never had such depth of appreciation or so many perceptions so quickly of so nuanced. You just see, okay, it's a blur of green. It's just nature. But now everything was separate. And so it was like joyous. I was like super joyous. And it was the contemplation of death under the influence of psychedelics made me super aware. And then the air raid siren stopped. And then I heard a guitar start. And I heard the drums start. And I was like, oh my God, I am so stupid. That was the next album that I put out that I had misinterpreted as this air raid siren. And once I realized that I was not going to die, that my life was not over, the bombs were not dropping on Tampa, I wasn't able to sustain that level of awareness of everything around me. My awareness sort of narrowed. And so I was left with, okay, I'm a jerk, I'm stupid. How can I do that? But also this connection between awareness of death, psychedelics, and hyper-awareness of life. Stuck. So that was a very early experience at age 21 that has sort of carried me through my life and has just told me that there are these deeper levels of awarenesses that make it all.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's a great story. I want to share a really quick story here about my first LSD experience when I was 18 that I think you're going to really appreciate, Rick. So my first experience was in a college dorm with one other person, and this completely changed the way I thought for the rest of my life. What happened was we both were on LSD, and there was a tinfoil, like a aluminum, tinfoil roll on the ground. And we both were sitting there, and all of a sudden we both watched this aluminum foil turn into an accordion worm and leave the room. And we only knew we both had the exact same hallucination after, because we were so mystified by that we just started talking about it. And that changed my life, because once I was off of the LSD, I said, how is it possible that two people can have the exact same hallucination? And then what is a hallucination? It just completely opened up my entire mind of, what is reality and how can we have a shared reality of something that's supposedly not happening? And it really opened up a lot for me. That was, my first sort of spiritual opening. My second experience isn't as glorifying. My second experience is the opposite, where it opened up my trauma. And that's why I'm so excited about what you're doing, because I believe that how we can really help heal this planet is when we make these medicines available, with the caveat that, we need to have providers around that are going to help you with troubling experiences when they arise, because they're coming eventually for anyone that uses these medicines.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what Stan talks about is birth trauma. I mean, we all have trauma encoded just through the process of being born. But I'm curious, what conclusion did you come to about how you both had the same hallucination?
My conclusion at that point in time was, okay, if this is possible, this means that there's another space that I'm not aware of where the mind operates, where we can have shared realities, where we can connect, our minds can connect in ways and get entangled. That was just sort of my initial thoughts was, wow, our minds can get entangled in some way that is not in a spoken space, where we can have shared experiences that are in sort of an unseen realm, and that people can get entangled. And this is now, of course, sent me years later in understanding entanglement and quantum entanglement in a whole new way later in life.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So let's see. We'd love to hear, Rick, any directions you would recommend people who are just beginning to hear this conversation about the possibilities of healing with psychedelics, favorite books or ways. Where should people go for more information?
Well, I would say Stan Grof, who's sort of my mentor and has trained Michael Midhofer and others, developed holotropic breath work, really the sort of premier psychedelic therapist. He helped create transpersonal psychology. He sort of summarized his life's work in a 2-volume series called The Way of the Psychonaut, an encyclopedia for inner journeys. And so I would recommend that people read that. I will say that it's a little bit difficult for me in that my mentor, who I think is brilliant, who's an incredible therapist and who has really got this encyclopedic mind. A little bit of this book is about transit astrology that he thinks is reflective of inner psychological dynamics. So that for me is a bridge too far. but there's part of the book is about that as well. And it's, but I think that that would be the one book I would recommend, The Way of the Psychonaut. There's another book that's really beautiful by Claudio Naranjo, written in 1972, called The Healing Journey. And it's about several different drugs, and it's exquisite. Claudio is also really a renowned psychedelic researcher and therapist. There's a movie I would recommend that people see, a documentary called Trip of Compassion. And I think it's on Vimeo or Netflix or something. And it's the best documentary ever made about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And it's about 3 of our Israeli subjects, and it's got English subtitles. A bunch of it is in English, and it's very powerful, and it's 3 different stories, and you see their actual therapy videos. Also, they've recreated the trauma situation, so you see actors recreating that, what they're thinking of, and then they interview family members as well. And they have nothing to say about politics or the science. Really, it's focused on the therapy. So I think Trip of Compassion would be a great one for people to see. There's been a book called The Secret Chief Revealed, and that's by Myron Stolaroff, about Leo Zeff, who was the secret chief. He was a clinical psych PhD. He's the one that really introduced MDMA into treatment in the middle 70s to early 80s. He trained 100 or so therapists and psychiatrists, and this is his reflections of his experience with different drugs and how to work with them as sort of the leader of the underground psychedelic therapy movement. So that book is also available from MAPS as our bookstore on the website, as is The Way of the Psychedelic.
And Rick, what would you say to the skeptics right now? Obviously, we're talking about changing a way of culture around the view around these really valuable medicines. So we still have a lot of skeptics out there that are, this is going to trigger psychosis and, all that kind of old language around it and thoughts. And, again, my personal experience, I've been around the block with all of this, and I'm a huge proponent of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And I'm not sure about just handing them to everyone. I'm just wondering your thoughts of what you would say to those skeptics.
Well, be skeptical. That's the first thing I would say. I mean, the whole scientific process that we're engaged in is about harnessing your skepticism to create methodologies that ideally eliminate experimenter bias or subject bias. So I welcome the skeptics. I mean, it's not for everybody. I think you're right. I mean, it can trigger psychotic reactions if people are not supported. And people can take psychedelics and be worse off. That doesn't mean we need the drug war to criminalize them under threat of jail. But I do think that there's a justification for skepticism, and that we should be held to the highest standards of proof, which is what the FDA is saying. I will say that Jeffrey Lieberman, who is the head of psychiatry at Columbia, the former president of the American Psychiatric Association, and an expert in schizophrenia, and Elias Dakar, one of his lead psychiatrists, they're interested in doing a study of MDMA for schizophrenia. Not for bipolar, not for frank psychosis, but it may be, because MDMA can be integrative. But if they do that study, it would be done on an inpatient basis, not an outpatient basis, so there could be a lot proper supervision. But I think for skeptics, we welcome skeptics. So, for example, part of our training program that we were just describing before is giving MDMA to therapists who volunteer to take it as a patient so they understand what the drug does. But we don't require that. And the reason that we don't require that is precisely because we want to welcome skeptics who don't want to do MDMA, but want to see the rest of the therapy training program.
Right. And they want to see the results, but they don't necessarily want to do it.
Yeah, and that's okay. Right. I mean, I don't think that they will be as effective with their patients if they had never done MDMA, but they could be still very effective. I just think their effectiveness would be increased if they knew subjectively what it was doing. So I think the skepticism I think people would have, and I think even maybe perhaps you were alluding to this a bit, would be more about like legalization or going beyond prohibition. So the controlled clinical settings with a doctor hopefully on call, not on site, with medical screenings, the safety profile, the risk benefit for that is much better than the risk benefit of people taking it on their own.
Right.
Mixing it with other drugs, they're not screened. Who knows what context they're taking it in. But nevertheless, I think that the risk-benefit analysis of prohibition is so negative,
Right.
That we should make it available. And that's why we need to really focus on honest drug education to children as they're growing up, not dare that scares them with bogus stories. And we also then need pure drugs so people are not, getting adulterated drugs. And we need harm reduction education for people in the emergency rooms and for the police and all of that. And then I think there will still be casualties. Nothing that's, perfectly safe, but that I think we can have way more benefits than downsides.
Great. Well, we like to end the same way with everyone. And I'd love to hear your take on this, which is if you had a billboard that every human being will see one time in their life, it has a paragraph on there. What do you want to tell them?
Your mind is deeper than you realize. And you're a lot more irrationally motivated than rationally motivated. And that it would be very helpful for you to do a deep dive into your mind, into your unconscious and your subconscious. And psychedelics, as Stan Grof has said, LSD is a non-specific amplifier of the unconscious. But while we talk about this as psychedelics, everybody does it every night in dreams. It's a natural part of what we do is to alternate between different modes of consciousness, and that this is something that the final billboard would say, and there are thousands of psychedelic clinics all over, right nearby you. You can go there.
That's great. I like that. And in our lifetime, we very well may see that, and we're close. So thanks for championing this work, Rick. So appreciative of you and what you're doing, and having you on the show.
Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to share the word with more people, particularly psychiatrists and therapists and others.
Yeah. Thanks, Rick, for your for just the inspiring example of taking such a big stand and seeing it through over so many years. And congratulations on the amazing results that you're getting.
Well, we're not through yet. I haven't seen it through yet. We got a few steps to go, but we're getting there.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you seem busy. We've ended the show, but you seem really busy in good ways right now. Talking to very influential people, which is really how you're going to make this happen. Yeah, I think it's happening. And I think we've gotten over the ghost of Timothy Leary and the idea that if you take these drugs, you're going to drop out of society and live on a commune and eat soybeans. You can be again. I think that we're going to, it's a different narrative now, that these can inspire people to contribute to society and help it become more healthy, because I think collectively human species is enormously destructive of the planet, of each other, and we need to evolve in order to survive. And I think psychedelics are a part of that evolution. Yeah. Rick, where did you grow up? In Chicago. In Chicago. And were you? Did you grow up in a religious Orthodox family or conservative? I am a conservative family. Yeah. So I actually was born in Chicago and grew up till I was 3 in Oak Park. Then we moved to Skokie, and I thought the whole world was Jewish. Skokie was like this Jewish little enclave. I remember when I was 6, my parents were explaining to me that not only was the whole world not Jewish, but we were this minuscule minority fraction of 1%. And that got me really scared. And I was like, oh my God, what if Jesus is the Messiah? What if they're right and we're wrong? Whatever. But so I grew up in Chicago until I was 17. Then we moved to Winnetka when I was about 11 and 12. And my parents had a house designed by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright's. So nice. I grew up in a very open house, which influenced me a lot. The house. Yeah. It's been a real pleasure, Rick. It's great to see you. It's been great connecting, Rick. Thanks for taking the time.